Hello, friends. I'm Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Roorkee, and I'm floating a course on health and disability in humanities. And under this caption, today I'm going to discuss disability and literature. Well, disability in literature explores how authors use bodily and cognitive differences to shape character, metaphor, and narrative. Historically, literature has often marginalized or villainized disabled characters. Today, however, disability studies and Crip theory reclaim these narratives, challenging ableist tropes and highlighting the lived experiences of disabled individuals. For centuries, literature has been obsessed with bodily and mental differences, but it has often used disability as a metaphor, a moral lesson, or a tragic plot device. In the health humanities, we challenge the perceived normal and the metaphorization of disability by shifting our focus from a purely clinical gaze to a cultural one. We want to move from asking what is the medical diagnosis of this character to asking how does the text construct the experience of this body and how do social structures restrict or liberate it. To do this critical work, we need a shared vocabulary, which brings us to the core models of disability that guide our reading. The foundational paradigm shift that changed the landscape of disability study is the distinction between the medical model and the social model. Under the medical or individual model, disability is viewed entirely as a pathology, a biological deficit, or a personal tragedy located within the individual body. In literature, this manifests as narratives driven by a quest for a cure or stories where a character must triumph over adversity through sheer willpower. Conversely, the social model introduces a radical shift by separating impairment, the physical or neurological difference, from disability. It argues that disability is actually created by an inaccessible world, architectural barriers, and systemic biases. When we apply this to literature, we stop looking at the character's body as the problem to be solved and start analyzing how the environment, the community, and societal expectations alienate and restrict them. Let us now analyze the difference between these models in more details and understand how it is applicable when analyzing literature. So, the first paradigm is the medical versus social models. Now, the analysis of disability in text is heavily guided by two sociological frameworks. The first one is the medical model, views disability as a defect or personal tragedy that must be fixed, cured, or managed. Older literature often focuses on narratives of a character trying to achieve able bodied normalcy. Coming to the social model, it suggests that disability is primarily caused by unaccommodating societal structures, physical barriers, and discriminatory attitudes. Now, coming to the key academic and literary resources to dive deeper into how disability shapes narrative theory and characterization, one can explore several foundational resources. And the first is academic text. Extraordinary Bodies by Rosemary Garland Thompson, which critiques how disabled bodies are figured in culture, and the Disability Studies Reader by Leonard J. Davis are staples in the field. Historical tropes and stereotypes that link directly to the two main ways disability has been represented in classic text types and how literal military history itself has been stereotyped. Let us know the historical tropes and stereotypes regarding disability in literature. So, traditionally, physical and cognitive impairments were rarely treated as authentic human experiences. Instead, authors use narrative prosthesis, that is, a method of using disability as a storytelling crutch to drive a plot forward or symbolize a moral lesson. We shall discuss narrative prosthesis in more detail later in this lecture. Some of the most common tropes and stereotypes that use disability as a prosthesis include the bitter villain. Physical differences mirror internal malice or evil. Examples include Shakespeare's Richard III or Captain Hook. This archetype will be discussed in greater detail later in this lecture. The pitiful burden, sweet innocent, disabled characters are stripped of agency and used solely to evoke sympathy or teach able bodied characters about compassion. And the examples include Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol. The inspirational super Crip that speaks of framing a disabled character as a tool to inspire others simply by surviving or performing everyday tasks through unrealistic sheer willpower. And the wise says magical deficit, trading a physical capacity for supernatural insight. For example, giving a blind character a mystical sixth sense or prophetic vision. Historical tropes and military stereotypes. History has a long tradition of stereotyping soldiers, armies, and warfare tactics based on nationalism and cultural bias. Let us discuss about this stereotype of representation or misrepresentation of military troops as it recurs time and again in literature. Troops and military stereotypes and dehumanization. The historical intersection of troops and military stereotypes reveals how empires, mass media, and wartime propaganda have systematically oversimplified the complex realities of combat. During periods of total war, governments rely heavily on media caricatures to manipulate public emotion and influence troop behavior. Throughout history, states have manufactured specific military archetypes to justify colonial recruitment, dehumanize adversaries, or boost domestic morale. The most persistent historical stereotypes about military troops include the martial races theory. One of the most pervasive military stereotypes in history was the martial races theory, officially codified by the British Empire after Indian uprising in 1857. This policy officially classified specific ethnic groups like Gurkhas, Sikh, Scottish Highlanders as inherently warlike, brave, and physically superior in combat, while labeling others as passive. The second one is the invincible Hollywood warrior. Media often portrays ancient and medieval troops engaging in immediate, full speed, chaotic charges that break out into individual sword duels. In reality, battles relied on strict, tightly organized formations like the Greek phalanx or Roman legion. The third one is the barbaric horde. Eastern nomadic or tribal troops such as Mongols or Apache forces are historically stereotyped in Western literature as lawless, undisciplined masses. In truth, groups like the Mongols utilized highly complex, regimented psychological warfare and sophisticated coordination. To lower the psychological barriers to killing, enemy troops are stripped of humanity. During World War I, Allied Propaganda transformed German soldiers into savage Huns, frequently depicting them in print as subhuman monsters. Monolithic national tactics, history, books, and pop culture frequently oversimplify how nations fight, such as stereotyping French troops as historically prone to retreat, or the Japanese military as exclusively utilizing suicidal banzai charges. These overlook the nuanced geopolitical strategies and diverse doctrines used across different centuries. Entire armies are often painted with a single tactical brush. For instance, Western histories frequently oversimplified Japanese troops in World War II as entirely devoid of self preservation, focusing strictly on suicidal banzai charges while completely ignoring their highly advanced, sophisticated jungle warfare doctrines. The natural born warrior states also romanticize their own regional troops to build a warrior mythos. In the United States during World War I, media and military publicity heavily embellished the stereotype of the rugged Appalachian mountaineer, such as war hero Sergeant Alvin York. The media claimed his wild mountain heritage inherently made him a superior pre programmed killer. And one such example is the myth. The British officially classified specific ethnic and geographic groups, such as Punjabi Sikh, Gurkhas, and Scottish Highlanders, as inherently brave, loyal, and physically superior in combat. Conversely, communities from central and eastern India were labeled as passive or non martial. The reality, and this was a political tool for control, not objective military science. The British targeted groups that had assisted them in suppressing the 1857 mutiny and systematically choked off recruitment from rebellious regions. Well, I'm discussing all these points to show that how they treat or define the very concept of disability. Therefore, I'm giving the example of the World War I and the World War II. The counter argument is that modern historians point out the theory's elegant, self serving hypocrisy. Indians who were intelligent and educated were defined as cowards, while those defined as brave were uneducated and backward, thereby making them easier for colonial officers to control without fear of political rebellion. Now, coming to the pop culture and Hollywood tropes about military troops, modern entertainment, particularly war films, continues to reinforce foundational myths about troops that distort operational history. The chaos charge speaks of epic historical films often depict ancient, medieval, or Napoleonic troops breaking ranks immediately into a chaotic full speed sprint that dissolves into individual sword duels. In reality, ancient warfare relied entirely on rigid group cohesion, like the Greek phalanx or Roman legion. Breaking formation meant instant death. The emotionless killing machine media frequently portrays soldiers as cold, unfeeling figures entirely detached from civil society. Modern psychological and sociological data heavily debunks this, showing that elite combat performance relies on rigorous self control, mental discipline, and deep communal ties rather than unhinged aggression. And see, these are the factors, controlling the very body contour of a human being, therefore, to define and redefine the concept of disability. The universally broken veteran, a widespread contemporary civilian stereotype, frames all returning combat troops as permanently damaged or universally suffering from severe PTSD. While mental health trauma is a critical and sober reality of warfare, Overgeneralizing it strips veterans of their diverse leadership capabilities, technical expertise, and resilience. For centuries, Western literature relied on a toxic psychological shorthand. If a character's body or mind was altered, their soul was corrupted. So, the disabled villain is one of the oldest, most deeply entrenched tropes in storytelling history. This is not just about bad people who happen to have scars. It is a systematic narrative device that uses disability to visually and psychologically manifest evil, and that is present and reused time and again in literature and popular culture. The core archetypes of disabled villain, the first is the bitter avenger, the why me monster. The trope, the character experiences a traumatic injury or disfigurement, and instead of processing it, they turn their rage outward against the entire able bodied world. Their entire personality is consumed by vengeance. Within the literary canon, there is Captain Ahab in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, who loses his leg to the white whale and destroys his entire crew in an obsessive, mad quest for revenge. Another villain character, Captain Hook, in Peter Pan, is entirely driven by his hatred of Peter Pan for cutting off his hand. So these are the examples showing the disability, but the strength, energy up to the extent to take revenge like a normal human being. The outer mirror of inner evil, the moral stain, and the trope, the character is born with a physical deformity or disability, which authors use as a literal outward manifestation of a warped, wicked soul. The disability is framed as a divine punishment or a natural warning sign to the audience. Within the literary canon, for an example, lies in Shakespeare's Richard III. Shakespeare famously manipulated historical truth to give Richard a hunchback, a withered arm, and a limp, explicitly writing that because Richard cannot be a lover due to his body, he is determined to prove a villain. The desperately flawed half man, the trope, the villain's impairment is used to strip them of their humanity, framing them as incomplete, monstrous, or subhuman. Within the literary canon, it is Long John Silver in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, while charismatic, his missing leg serves as a constant visual cue to the reader that is a fragmented, untrustworthy pirate who operates outside civilized law. The modern subversion, flipping the script of disability in contemporary literature, is one of the aspects to know about the modern literature and disability. So, modern literature is seeing a surge of hashtag own voices narratives where disabled authors write about disabled characters. Books typically move away from curing the protagonist and focus on identity, the politics of access, and the rich diversity of disabled communities. Modern hashtag own voices literature and contemporary authors are actively dismantling this trope, showing that the true evil is not the disabled body, it is the ableist society surrounding it. It does that by the following mechanisms, and the first is reclaiming the narrative. Modern retelling often re-evaluate classic villains, for example, fractured fairy tales or modern fantasy often recast the monstrous, deformed character as a misunderstood protagonist fighting against a superficial, cruel empire. Coming to the next aspect, that is of complex antagonism. When modern literature does feature a disabled antagonist, their villainy is born from political greed, systemic trauma, or human choices completely disconnected from their physical or cognitive differences. in the field of medical humanities. Thus, the disabled villain is analyzed not just as a bad guy, but as a cultural symptoms. Medical humanities synthesizes literature, clinical medicine, and disability study to examine how representation reinforces ableism and pathologizes differences. When looking through a medical humanities lens, the core archetypes of the disabled villain shift from simple creative choices into distinct symbolic and psychological functions, such as the pathologized mastermind, the intellectual overcompensation. And the clinical framing speaks that this archetype features a villain with a severe physical impairment, often requiring mobility aids or life support, who possesses a hyper developed evil genius intellect. The medical humanities critique says that medical humanities charts this as a manifestation of societal anxiety regarding cognitive versus physical equilibrium. It lends on the false eugenist premise that a broken body must overcompensate with a predatory mind to survive. It pathologizes intelligence, transforming intellect into a weapon fueled by bitterness over bodily loss. Coming to the biologically punished, the somatization of evil. The clinical framing, the character commits an immoral or taboo act, and their subsequent disability or disfigurement is inflicted as a direct, visible consequence of their sins. And the medical humanities critique speaks this relies on somatization, rendering a moral failing into a physical symptom. Historically, this aligns with pre modern medical beliefs that disease, leprosy, or physical differences were divine punishments or signs of spiritual wrath. By making disability the result of being evil, it subtly teaches audiences that real world disabled people deserved their conditions. Classical examples are that Darth Vader, whose permanent reliance on an artificial respirator and prosthetics is direct consequences of his turn to the dark side, or a scar in The Lion King, whose facial anomaly brands his treachery. The medical obsessive, the desperate cure seeker, the clinical framing, the villain is entirely motivated by a ruthless, destructive desire to escape their disability, fix their body, or achieve normative, able bodied perfection at any cost. The medical humanities critics says this archetype directly critiques the strict medical model of disability, which views a non-normative body in an inherent tragedy requiring a cure. By framing the villain's entire motive around a desperate desire to become able-bodied, literature validates the ableist assumption that living with a disability is worse than death, justifying unethical behavior. And the classic examples are the Phantom in The Phantom of the Opera or Howard Clifford in Detective Pikachu, who attempts to transfer his mind out of his paralyzed body into a powerful creature. Coming to the moral mirror, the aesthetic moral binary, the first one is the clinical framing, and the villain is given explicit scars, asymmetrical features, or a missing limb solely to serve as a stark visual contrast to a physically flawless, pure hearted hero. The medical humanities critics speaks scholars like Rosemary Garland Thompson note that this creates a toxic binary between the healthy beautiful and the pathological ugly. It uses the disabled body as a visual shorthand for danger, completely denying the character complex personhood. The audience is trained to look at a scar and instantly register threat. And the classic examples are Captain Hook, pitted against the physically unblemished Peter Pan, or almost every classic James Bond villain, that is, Lee Schiffer's bleeding eye, Alec Trevelyan's facial burns. The aesthetic moral binary scholars like Tobin Siebers, author of Disability Aesthetics, and Rosemary Garland Thompson expand this into questioning the rigid dualistic taxonomy used by dominant cultures to enforce ableism. Rather than depicting a disability as a neutral biological variation or a lived daily reality, cultural narratives routinely force it into an absolute dualistic trap. The aesthetic dimension, how the body looks, acts, or disrupts the visual narrative landscape, is immediately weaponized to signify the moral dimension, the internal goodness, spiritual decay, or ethical standing of the character. Let us discuss in some more detail about the moral mirror. So, the moral mirror is a narrative phenomenon where a character's physical exterior is treated as a flawless reflection of their internal soul. In older Western literature and pre modern medical philosophy, a person's outer appearance was not viewed as a biological coincidence. Instead, it acted as a visible divine scoreboard of their morality. Through this framework, the medical humanities critique how narrative traditions enforce two toxic mirrors: the symmetrical mirror, that is goodness, physical symmetry, flawless skin, and an able, unblemished body are mirrored as sign of spiritual purity, innocence, and divine favor. The asymmetrical mirror, sin, physical anomalies, scars, chronic illness, or missing limbs are mirrored as a stain, the somatic visibility of hidden corruption, greed, or divine punishment. The disability exists solely to visually alert the reader to a flawed character. In everyday consumption, these judgments of aesthetic value bleed completely into evaluations of moral worth. The binary ensures that when an audience sees physical difference, they are conditioned to experience an instantaneous moral alarm. A crisis theorist, Atto Quashon, calls aesthetic nervousness. This nervousness is the psychological driver of the moral mirror, as the spectator's anxiety over a disrupted aesthetic is redirected inward, forcing a confrontation with their own ethical stability. Furthermore, this effective crisis initiates the structural process of narrative prosthesis. The text introduces the disabled body specifically to provoke this aesthetic nervousness, using the resulting tension to drive the plot toward a resolution that eventually corrects or erases the difference to restore a sense of normative comfort. In the context of medical humanities and disability studies, the concepts of the moral mirror and the aesthetic moral binary explain how society links physical appearance directly to an individual's ethical worth. These ideas analyze how cultural narratives use the human body as a visual canvas to signify goodness or evil, establishing deep seated biases that impact real world clinical and social treatment. Coming to the psychology behind these tropes of using disability in literature, and in literary theory, this phenomenon is heavily analyzed through Crip theory and disability study using two main concepts. The fear of interdependency. This is one of the main aspects. So historically, society feared vulnerability by turning the disabled character into an aggressive, terrifying villain turn, literature projected society's collective fear of bodily decay and loss of control onto a monstrous other. The narrative prosthesis, coined by theorists David T. Michel and Sharon L. Cinder in their seminal book, Narrative Prosthesis, speaks of disability and the dependencies of discourse, and this theory proves that literature uses disability as a crutch to create instant drama, conflict, or metaphorical depth. The villain's body does all the heavy lifting to show the audience this person is dangerous, saving the author from having to write complex motivations. It gives the villain an instant origin story, a visual identity, and a psychological motive without requiring deep, nuanced character development. Michel and Snyder argue that disability is the literal engine of Western storytelling, while other marginalized groups based on race or gender have historically suffered from an absence or exclusion of image in media. Disabled people have faced the opposite problem, a perpetual overcirculation of deeply flawed symbolic images. In literature, authors do not write disabled characters to explore their actual lived realities. Instead, they use disability as an opportunistic, metaphorical device, a crutch, to give their plot immediate dramatic weight, shock value, or moral imagery. According to Michel and Sender, this narrative process operates as a rigid, self perpetuating four stage structure in literature. So, the stage one, the mark of difference, exposition. The text introduces a bodily or cognitive deviance using the aesthetic moral binary to make an abstract cultural, psychological, or ethical crisis immediately visible to the audience. Stage two, the metaphorical translation, and that is discourse. The narrative actively ignores the material, lived reality of the impairment. Instead, the disabled body is translated into a profound social metaphor or an intense site of aesthetic nervousness, acting as a moral mirror for the characters around it. Stage 3, the testing of the normate climax. The disabled character is brought to the center of the text to serve as a crucial testing ground or a structural catalyst for the moral, emotional, or spiritual development of the able bodied protagonist. Stage 4, the eraser of difference, resolution. Because the narrative cannot tolerate the ongoing presence of bodily deviance, the structure moves towards closure. To relieve the lingering aesthetic nervousness and restore normative comfort, the text must eliminate the difference either through a miraculous institutional cure or by killing the character off entirely. Having mapped how literary narratives rely on disability according to the mechanics of narrative prosthesis, we must now examine how these structural tropes mirror real world system of control under a medical regime that actively pathologizes variant bodies. So, coming to this pathologizing variant bodies, biomedical discourse, and the institutional production of disability. Ehrlich argued that industrialized medicine has crossed a threshold of utility. Beyond this point, the medical establishment creates more sickness than it heals. Biomedical discourse plays a vital role in this process by rewriting the human experience. It shifts the definition of health away from an individual's autonomous capacity to cope with reality, turning it into a passive state dependent on lifelong institutional and pharmaceutical management. In the medical humanities, this connects directly to disability by exposing how the medical complex pathologizes natural human variation. by stripping individuals of their autonomous capacity to adapt to their bodily or cognitive realities. This biomedical discourse transforms disability into a state of permanent clinical deficit and engineered institutional dependency. So, role of biomedical for narrative translation speaks of biomedical discourse provides the raw material for narrative translation. It acts as a catalyst for human storytelling. A cold clinical diagnosis is often the exact trigger for a profound personal narrative. And the importance is that humanists study how a patient takes a harsh biomedical phrase, a stage 4 adenocarcinoma, that is cancer, and translates it into a personal emotional story of survival, fear, and identity. And the result is that without the precise, concrete anchor of biomedical facts, the human stories of illness would lack their real world urgency and situational context. It highlights the structural limits of science. Biomedical discourse is important because it very precision reveals where objective science ends and human experience begins, and the importance by mapping what biomedicine can say, that is measuring exact lung capacity. Humanist can clearly point out what it cannot say, that is describing the suffocating anxiety of a panic attack. And the result is that this boundary marking helps healthcare systems recognize when a patient needs psychological, social, or spiritual support alongside pharmaceutical treatment. Coming to the mechanism of linguistic control regarding health and disability in humanities, the first point is epistemic injustice. This occurs when a patient's subjective testimony regarding their own body is dismissed or undervalued by healthcare providers because it lacks objective biomedical phrasing. It directly silences marginalized groups, chronic pain sufferers, and neurodivergent individuals. Diagnostic labeling, to name a condition, is to possess power over it. Biomedical discourse dictates what is considered a normal body or mind and what is classified as a pathology or disorder. These linguistic boundaries directly influence legal rights, insurance coverage, and social stigma. The war metaphor and biomedical discourse heavily relies on militaristic metaphor, that is fighting cancer, invading pathogens, and magic bullets. While motivating for some, this linguistic framing pressures patient into an aggressive combative stance and implies personal failure or surrender if the body succumbs to disease. Goal of studying disability in medical and health humanities. It covers that the primary goal of studying these concepts in the medical humanity is to express how this ancient literary binary and normal, as defined by biomedical discourse, still corrupts modern objective clinical environments. So, the halo effect in healthcare says that because of aesthetic moral binary, clinicians can unconsciously associate normative conventions of attractiveness or able body fitness with compliance, honesty, and mental stability. The diagnostic shadowing of stigma and patients with visible facial anomalies, physical disfigurements, or physical disabilities are often subjected to societal discomfort. Their physical appearance acts as a deforming mirror, where healthcare providers might treat them with immediate pity, lower expectation of agency, or hyper focus on their outward deficit rather than their actual systemic health choices. Dismantling normality. By breaking down this binary, health humanities work to untangle the historical knot connecting a body's shape to a soul's value, advocating for a medical framework that treats bodily diversity as a natural human variance rather than a moral failure. So this is all for this lecture. In the next lecture, we will discuss about the conception of other in health humanities, and this is also related to disability, how a disabled person is marginalized, and its core dimension frameworks, and the conceptualization of vulnerability and interdependence in care ethics and solidarity. Till then, thank you.